Another theme that you might be asked to talk about is the role of women and their repression. These texts are based in, societies that don't have the same values as our own, purely because, they were quite a long time ago, and social values have changed quite a bit. So you will notice that the attitude towards women by authority figures and other figures in the community is quite different to, what we would accept today. In the Crucible, there's two forms of repression, and one is inchoate sexuality, and another one is repression of just vain enjoyment, which is a quote, vain enjoyment. So with the sexuality, it's really seen through Abigail and John. So in many ways, it brings about the collapse of society and disintegration of its guiding principles. This idea finds clearest example in the affair between John Proctor and Abigail. Abigail's plea for John to give her a soft word and her desire to dance with Proctor on his wife's grave arguably causes the undoing of the entire community, and that's demonstrated through, you've got the descriptions of the orphans wandering from house to house, the abandoned cattle, and the stink of the rotting crops everywhere. Abigail is able to bring about complete social disarray, illustrating how female sexual desire can ultimately undo a previously unified and resilient society where, open quote, vengeance is walking Salem, end quote. One of the principal changes Miller made in dramatizing the events of the Salem witch trials was to raise the age of the children, thereby injecting, a sexual motivation into their actions and providing a correctly identified vital element of Puritan repressions. This arguably becomes the fulcrum of the play, as Abigail was the human centre of all this turmoil. There's also repression of vain enjoyment, which isn't necessarily sexual. There's, unseen represents suppression of desire in Salem, and that can be seen through, you never really you never see the fact that, they were in the forest and they were, dancing. You only get to know about it through how the men have been talking about it when they were dancing like heathen in the forest. The girls can't dance in Salem, so they have to retreat to the woods to enjoy themselves. Betty Paris's room is also described. The wood colours are raw and unmellowed. That's quite an unpleasant environment for a child. It's got nothing to stimulate the imagination. And that's demonstrating how the imagination of young girls is attempted to be suppressed, hence why they kind of have to, in such a parochial society, how they have to, seek fun through the unseen, which is represented by the woods. In Year of Wonders, Annis Gowdy, Eleanor, they're pretty good examples for how women have been repressed in their communities. With Annis, while there was no doubt that she did good, she was branded as a sinner in the reckoning of their religion for her freedom of sexuality and fornication. Her lack of regard for the strict sexual mores of the time rendered her vulnerable against attacks or punishment. Urith Gordon's accusation that Annis witched her husband into lying with her reveals how jealousy arising from Annis's affairs with married men is a contributing factor which promotes the calamity that ensues. Annis's promiscuity is revealed in the complacency with which he remarks that sex with Mr. Vickers was naught more to either of them than a meal to a hungry traveller. That quote also shows how, quite repressed the women are. Then there's also Eleanor Montpelion. Her sexual desire and lust elicits an internal crisis for her. Brooke's depiction of Montpelion in his relationship with Eleanor ultimately exposes her feminist ideals, condemning the notion that a husband feels a need to impose ideals upon his wife and to punish her relentlessly for what he perceives to be a sin. Anna's abhorrence to Montpelion's beliefs is employed by Brooks to express her own beliefs and to critique the patriarchal values present in 17th century England. Through Anna's symbolic mounting of Anteros, the black stallion, by herself, quote, preferring an ungraceful scramble to the touch of Montpelion's hand, Brooks celebrates female triumph over sexist societal views and affirms her feminist motivations. So clearly, Brooks has quite an agenda for feminist motivations. She is kind of trying to help facilitate Anna's personal growth through, how she mounts Andros. She doesn't want to, be touched by someone who's been so repressive to her friend. And when we talked about personal growth and internal conflict, I mentioned a few things about how Anna herself has grown. In The Crucible, however, Miller doesn't really have a feminist agenda like you could argue that Brooks does. Instead, he's just kind of presenting the ways that their inchoate sexuality has been repressed, as well as how just women and girls in general are oppressed, seen through Betty Parris's room.